All right, so now we're going to move on to our final session, which is Professor Kubek and Attorney Chesley Roberts. They're going to talk about military sexual trauma and representing survivors.
Hi, everyone. Do we have Chesley? Yeah, there's Chesley.
I'm here.
All right. Okay, Chesley, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'll start it off. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This session will cover best practices for handling VA compensation claims related to military sexual trauma and how you as an advocate can represent survivors through a trauma-informed approach. My name is Chesley Roberts. I am an Equal Justice Works Fellow sponsored by Lockheed Martin Corporation. I currently work at the Veterans Consortium in DC, where I manage our Women Veterans Legal Assistance Program.
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Samantha Kubek. I am currently an assistant professor and director of the Veterans Clinic at Hofstra Law School in Long Island. Prior to joining Hofstra this fall, I was a staff attorney at the New York Legal Assistance Group, where I established the first legal clinic in the country to exclusively serve women veterans. My focus was on survivors of military sexual trauma and approaching this work, as Chesley said, with a trauma-informed lens.
Okay, so our objectives for today is to provide an understanding of what constitutes military sexual trauma, address the common myths and misconceptions, discuss how to conduct proper record review for MST cases, educate on methods of providing trauma-informed legal services, and then walk through the steps of an MST claim and provide best practices for each step of the process. So what is military sexual trauma? The VA defines MST as a psychological trauma resulting from a physical assault of a sexual nature, battery of a sexual nature, or sexual harassment which occurred while the veteran was serving on active duty training, active duty for training, or an active duty training. This can include unwanted sexual touching or grabbing, threatening, offensive remarks about a person's body or sexual activities, threatening or unwelcome sexual advances. So as you can see, the VA provides a broad definition. And additionally, MST can occur at any time during active duty. It doesn't matter if the survivor was on or off base or whether they were on or off duty at the time. So sexual assault continues to be a serious problem in the military. About every 30 minutes, a service member is assaulted. 1 in 3 women report experiencing MST, and about 4% of males report experiencing MST, but roughly 3/4 of survivors do not report at all. In 2014, it was estimated about 28 sexual assaults occurred every day. In 2018, it was estimated that 20,500 service members were sexually assaulted, which broke down to 13,000 women experiencing MST and about 7,500 men. And then in 2020, in cases where military could act, only 4% of cases were prosecuted, and in that number, less than 1% of the offenders were actually convicted. The Department of Defense has not broken down sexual assault and harassment statistics by race. However, oftentimes racism is related to experience of MST. So when relevant, include references to the environment and race-related issues experienced by your client in your brief and in the veteran's personal statement. So it's important to realize that MST is not like other trauma. It's different than other trauma and different than other sexual assaults. And we're not ranking sexual assaults, but it's important to realize that military sexual trauma is inherently different. And this is partly because the military environment is unique. The place where the assault occurs is where the service member works, where the service member lives, and they can't just quit. And most of the time, the survivor may not be able to get away from their attacker. In 24% of cases where a female service member was sexually assaulted, the attacker was someone in their chain of command. And then military culture also emphasizes honor and loyalty and duty and to one's unit, country, and mission. And usually this involves commitment even at the expense of the survivor. So there are many beliefs held by advocates and veterans that can disrupt the process of obtaining VA benefits for survivors. By percentage, women are at greater risk of MST, but anyone can experience an MST, and that includes male service members as well. And when it comes to male service members who experience same-sex assault, they may fear being labeled as gay, but as we know, that may not always be the case. And then anyone at any age can be a survivor. Personally, my clients range from 20 years old to 65 years old, but I know Samantha has said that she's seen a client in her 80s before. And then when it comes to demeanor, it's important to keep in mind that MST can affect everyone differently. So you may have a client that will tell you everything that happened to them in their first meeting, the first time you speak with them. Or you may have a client that will be a little bit more hesitant to speak with you. So it may take a few meetings to understand exactly what happened to them. So here are some common myths. All survivors are women. As we just mentioned, men and women can be affected by MST. All survivors have PTSD. So while MST is a frequent cause of PTSD, survivors also may experience depression, anxiety, mood disorders, or substance abuse. All MST-related wounds are mental. MST is associated with both mental health and physical health conditions. All survivors remember the details. While in fact, memory loss is a very common symptom of PTSD, or you also may have a client who have blocked out memories of the assault in an attempt to protect themselves. All survivors engage in treatment. A lot of treatment is tied to reporting the MST. And as we already talked about 75% of assaults go unreported. So a lot of survivors are not receiving the treatment that they need. And then lastly, sexual assault equals rape. The term MST used by the VA is a broad definition. And so it does not only include rape, it encompasses other forms of sexual assault and harassment. So many survivors may not even realize that they experienced MST while in service, because they may think just because they were not raped that they do not fall under that category.
Sorry, slides having an issue transferring. Oh, there we go.
No problem. So these are some misconceptions that your client may be thinking when they come to see you. And they may have these misconceptions because they were told wrong by a friend, or may be due to a bad VA regulation. But by understanding and recognizing these misconceptions and with the myths we just talked about, you'll be able to understand your client's needs better, and you'll also be able to improve your engagement with them. So a couple common misconceptions could be, if I didn't report, I can't file a claim for benefits. The VA does not require the veteran to have reported, and actually the VA can't use the lack of reporting as evidence that this sexual assault did not occur. If I didn't get treatment in the military, or if I didn't get treatment for years, I can't file a claim for benefits. There is no timeline for the veteran to have to start treatment in order to file for benefits. If I don't have PTSD, I can't file for benefits. MST can be a cause of different mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety. It can also cause physical health conditions, so it's not only PTSD. If I don't have medication, I can't file a claim. If I wasn't raped, I can't file a claim. But as we've talked about, it encompasses, the term MST encompasses more than just being raped. And then lastly, if I consented under pressure, I can't file a claim for benefits. Consenting under pressure is not consent, so it's technically still an MST. Okay, so the effect of MST. Because military sexual trauma is not a diagnosis or a condition, but instead an experience, there is no common symptoms of MST, and veterans can react in different ways. And they can react different ways, especially based on their gender, their race, their background, or any other stressful life experiences that they may have had. And then also they can have different diagnoses, as we mentioned, to include depression, mood disorders, substance abuse disorders, and PTSD. So we've been talking about PTSD, so I just want to talk a little bit more in detail about it. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a potentially debilitating psychological condition arising from traumatic events. With PTSD, the survivor experiences unwanted or intrusive memories, or lives a trauma on a frequent and sustained basis. Research has shown that sexual assaults are more likely to result in symptoms of PTSD when compared to other types of trauma, and this includes combat trauma. So as I just mentioned, MST is an experience and not a diagnosis. So MST is the underlying trauma to the medical condition that the veteran has. The veteran will not receive the service connection for the MST, but instead they'll receive it for the underlying condition. For example, if your client has been diagnosed with PTSD, you can file for compensation for PTSD. So let's talk a little bit more about obtaining the service connection for MST-related illnesses. Historically, claims for service connection for PTSD claims based on MST have been disproportionately denied. In 2013, there was a lawsuit that highlighted the fact that there was a 10% difference between the denial rates of PTSD claims for men and women. In 2018, the VA's Office of Inspector General, or OIG, found that there was so many problems with the processing of PTSD claims based on MST. So in that report, the OIG made some recommendations, including recommending the VBA to make improvements on oversight and training on the process of MST-related claims. However, last month, the OIG once again found that there's still problems persisting with the processing of these claims. Specifically, the OIG found that more than half of the MST-related claims were improperly processed. Ultimately, investigators determined that the VBA did not follow and did not effectively implement the recommendations from the previous report. So 3 elements of a successful claim. So first, you're going to have the in-service event or injury, and in our case, that will be the MST. Number 2, a current physical or mental health condition. And number 3, a nexus or a link between the in-service event and current disability. For MST claims, proving elements number 1 and number 3 are often complicated because since many cases go unreported, there may not be proof of the assault. And then when trying to prove the nexus, if your client has any pre or post-service trauma, this may cause some issues in showing that their current condition was related to the MST and not any other trauma they may have experienced. So what if the veteran didn't report? Survivors often cite 2 barriers to reporting, including fear of not being believed, fear of being stigmatized, fear of retaliation, or they didn't know that they had resources available to them. So addressing the proof of this event can be incredibly difficult. And then on top of the reasons I just mentioned, you can add in the fact that it's their workplace and they live there and they don't want to disrupt that unit cohesion, or they maybe fear that they may have accusations of fraternization. And then also they may be trying to survive combat and they have a commitment to their mission and they want to fulfill that commitment. So how do you corroborate that MST occurred if they didn't report? The VA uses markers. So you can use markers when there is no direct hard evidence. And there probably will not be records from law enforcement or any obvious notes. So combing through the in-service records and the medical records can help you find evidence to corroborate the occurrence of MST. You will want to look for pregnancies or termination of a pregnancy, STD tests, medical visits to include trip to gynecologist or any mental health related visits. As you can see in the example, there is a medical record note that shows an infection and then a potential note of rape. So you can look for things like that to corroborate the MST, but also look for requests for transfers or requests to be discharged, or if there's any referencing to any bullying or assaults. So you will always want to keep markers in mind. And so markers are used to show the effects or consequences of the personal trauma on the veteran. A marker can be one or more behavioral changes or a pattern of change behavior. So for example, one marker can be changes in performance or evaluations. So you'll want to look through the service records to see if there's a documented change or deterioration in their work, or there's a record of insubordination after the assault, or prior to the assault, they were always followed the rules and they never had a work-related issue. We can also look for any unexplained economic or social changes, increased alcohol or drug use, a breakup of a relationship. But this is not an exhaustive list. There are more markers that the VA can use to corroborate MST. Okay, so the veteran's personal statement. A personal statement can be one of the most important pieces of evidence to add to the claim. So this is the veteran's opportunity to tell their story exactly as it happened to them. And it also gives you a chance to humanize your client and show the VA who they are as a person. So you would want to submit, in support of the veteran's application, you want to submit a statement in support of their claim form. And for MST related claims, the VA uses a special version of the form, which is VA form 0781A. But keep in mind when writing their statement that their story may change. The veteran may have limited memories, or they may not know much, or they may have forgotten some details. So reviewing the record and creating a timeline prior to interviewing the veteran for the personal statement will help you understand what information is needed. Because inconsistent reporting can be viewed by the VA as evidence of lack of credibility. So if you see any inconsistencies, just make sure to advocate around that point. And also something else to keep in mind is writing the statement can be very re-traumatizing or triggering for the veteran. And in a few minutes, Samantha will give some techniques on how to interview veterans. Okay, so the form VA 210781, they do not give a lot of space for the veteran to write out the personal statement. So you don't want to limit yourself to that form or limit the veteran to that form. So what you want to do is include the form, but in the little box it says for the description, just write "see attached," and then attach the veteran's personal statement to the form. Most claims are denied due to a lack of detail provided, so make sure to give as many details as possible. And the veteran may not remember everything. They may not know the name of their attacker. They may not remember the exact date it occurred, and that is okay. Just to give as many details as the veteran does remember. Because you will need to explain the full story of their service, the assault itself, and the impact that assault had on them during service and post-service. So you want to include things about like why they joined, about their basic training, any other training they had, how their life in the service was before the assault happened, the assault itself. After the assault, how was their life different in the service, and ultimately their discharge. And then at the end, include some information about their life since the military. And this will include things like their symptoms they're currently experiencing, any treatment they've had, if they're receiving treatment, and the impact that the assault had on their social life and their work life. So this is just a chart to show some of the things I just talked about to add to your statement. Start with the introduction, then just do a chronological order about their service, how their service was, the assault, after service, and then post-life military. With the assault, use whatever words they are comfortable with, the veteran's comfortable with, and then you can add your own words into the brief if you prefer.
Okay. So thank you, Chesley. So we're going to talk now about some tips and best practices to make sure that when you are interviewing survivors of MST to get their personal statement and to learn more about what has happened, that you are doing your best to minimize the re-traumatization of your client. Sorry, the clicker is a little bit slow. Here we go. So trauma is the experience of severe psychological distress from a terrible or life-threatening event. And this image that you see on the left side of the screen depicts, this is a child's brain, but it shows on the left side, you see what a healthy brain looks like. On the right side, you see the brain of an abused child. And you can see the ways that trauma has an actual physical impact on one's body. It's not just the brain, but the brain is a good example. And it shows that certain areas of the brain here aren't lighting up in the way that they would in an individual who had not experienced such trauma. And so this is just something to keep in mind as you're working with clients. They may re-experience their trauma as they are talking to you or as you are going through the case. They can become very emotional. They may avoid your calls. They may avoid the meeting when they need to talk to you about what happened. They may be very hypervigilant and aware of what's going on at all times, may be difficult for them to focus. And so if you can understand why a veteran is reacting a certain way, you can then tailor your approach to fit your individual client's needs. As I said, your client may avoid answering your calls or may miss appointments. They may have difficulty focusing on the task at hand. They may have a fractured memory or might forget to complete things that you've asked them to do. And so we'll talk about how you can work around these issues. When it comes to avoidance, I always say to my clients, I know that on any given day, you may be having a particularly difficult day. It may be a day where it is not good for you to be talking about what happened to you. All I ask is don't ignore my call. Simply pick up the phone and say to me, today is not a good day, and I'll call you back. But that way I know you're still engaged in the case, you're still there, and I'll call you back. I can understand that, sometimes we all have bad days. The client having difficulty focusing, trying to do things, asking the client whether it would be more helpful to do things in small, concrete steps, small meetings versus longer meetings, whatever is easiest for them to sort of handle. Writing things down, putting things in writing after you discuss them with the client in terms of things you may need from them can be really helpful in terms of making sure they remember things. It's important to acknowledge the fact that this is a difficult process. This is hard. This is tiresome and exhausting for your client as you are going through this. And to some degree, it is very likely that your client's symptoms may worsen as you are helping them through this case, hopefully with the goal that in the end they will be doing better, but they may in the very immediacy feel a heightened sense of symptoms that may have been a little bit more dormant when they weren't talking about this. Setting expectations, setting a schedule, setting clear boundaries and expectations of each meeting. I have many clients who tell me that the night before they come in to talk with me about what happened to them, they don't sleep. So I make sure to tell them when the times they're meeting with me, we're not going to be talking about their trauma, because we don't talk about their trauma every single time they meet with me. Sometimes I just need them to come in and sign a form. And so it's important to let your client know what to expect from the meeting so that they know how much they need to prepare themselves. On the flip side, I sometimes tell my clients that, we are going to be talking about your trauma, and this might be really difficult for you. I used to work within a medical legal partnership where I was meeting with my clients oftentimes on site at the VA hospital. I would say to my clients, perhaps you want to schedule an appointment with your therapist for following our meeting so that you can process, whatever memories have come up. And I know that you're in a safe space. Or perhaps you want to have a partner or a friend pick you up from our appointment so that you're not going home alone. Circling back on details, sometimes your clients don't know what the most salient details are, and they may just be sort of almost word vomiting at you about their story. And so if you hear something, you don't need to necessarily interrupt, but make a note to yourself that you want to circle back and ask some more questions about that moment can be really helpful. I also utilize grounding techniques with my clients, which are basically mechanisms for reminding your client that even if they are experiencing intrusive memories, strong nightmares, if they're having flashbacks as they're working with you, grounding them in the moment and reminding them that they are not actually back where they previously were. I used to send my clients to their CNP exams with a paperclip in their hand, and I would tell them that if they felt they were about to experience a flashback, to squeeze the paperclip as hard as they could. And remember that in the moment of their assault, in the moment of their harassment, whatever it may have been, they weren't holding a paperclip, and let that paperclip remind them that they are here now in this doctor's office. They are not back there. And that as bad as this moment may feel, they can never actually be forced to relive that experience and go through it again. They have survived. They are here today. And things like that can be helpful to making sure that your client doesn't spiral too much. So for the first meeting, it's really important to create that structure to empower your client with ownership over the process and letting them know that this is how we're going to meet today. You don't need to think you're going to be in my office for 3 hours. You know, we're going to meet for 45 minutes. We're going to meet for 1 hour, whatever it may be. Being honest with your client about their expectations of how the process is going to go, letting them know, finding out what they want help with, and then clarifying to them what it is you're actually able to assist with. It's also helpful to identify other people in the client's life that might be helpful in the case, whether it be helping them to obtain a document, whether it be offering them support, a therapist, a social worker, a partner, a friend, whatever it may be, and setting boundaries with your clients. This work is not only hard on the veteran, but it also can be hard on you as the attorney. And so it's important to set those boundaries, whether it be, informing your client, I'm in the clinic from 10 to 5, 10 to 6, 10 to 12, and then again, 3 to 5, whatever those hours are, you're welcome to call me during those hours. If you call me outside of those hours, I'm not going to be there. You can always leave me a message and I'll get back to you. But just letting them know what to expect so that you don't end up with the client who's sitting there being like, I called you 3 times last night. And you're like, you called me 3 times at 11 p.m. I'm not there at those hours. And so that can just help establish a stronger, more trusting relationship with the client from the jump, which is very helpful in a case where you are going to be getting into such intimate details with your client. Also, I never ask my clients to tell me their story of their sexual assault or sexual harassment in the first meeting. Think about your clients as regular people, right? You wouldn't meet someone for the very first time and say, tell me about the worst moment of your life. That just wouldn't be how you interact. And it's the same way with clients. You need to establish some level of a relationship before then. You definitely need to know what they're there for. You definitely need to know how you can help them, but you don't need to get into the details of their story. Let them know, the fact that you will ultimately need to speak with them about what happened, but that's not necessarily today. To the extent that you are able to put power back in their hands, you can make this process really restorative for your clients, despite its difficulties. I will speak with my clients about the fact that when we are going to talk about their story, they will have options of how we go about that conversation, because this is their story. I'm here to listen, and whatever way they're going to be safest in telling that story is the way I want to go about things. So in that first meeting, I focus on completing really simple tasks, filling out the SF-180 and the VA medical records requests, any HIPAA forms I might need from them, things like that that don't require delving into the details of their story. When you are interviewing your client about their trauma, it can be helpful to repeat things they've said or paraphrase things to ensure you're understanding correctly. There are a lot of nuances, particularly in the realms of assault and rape. And so making sure that you're fully understanding not just what happened, but what they were feeling or thinking in that moment. So when a client says to you, for example, I didn't want to be around my supervisor, he frightened me. Saying things like, it sounds like you were concerned about your safety when you were alone with your supervisor, allows the client to either say yes, or to say, I wasn't concerned about my safety. I didn't think they would hurt me, but I was worried that they would say things that would make me uncomfortable, right? Getting that clarification of what exactly was going on. Encouraging your client to elaborate. Oftentimes clients will say, big statements like the military treated me unfairly, asking for an example of what they mean by that, and asking in a way that shows that you believe them and you're just trying to get more information. You're not trying to disprove them, right? So the military really treated me unfairly. That sounds really difficult. Can you give me an example of something that happened? Utilizing question style to help you keep some control over the interview can be really helpful. Oftentimes clients will sort of just Some clients will be completely not talkative. Other clients will just all of a sudden dive into just a rant about what happened and won't necessarily have control over the flow. They may have a fractured memory such that their story is a little bit all over the place and it's hard to follow what's going on. Asking yes or no questions, or questions with really concrete answers, such as, what base were you located at when this happened, can be really helpful when you need specific concrete information from the client. Whereas open-ended questions can be helpful in trying to get your client talking a little bit more, trying to just sort of get a general sense of what's going on, asking questions like, tell me about basic training. What was that like for you? Can get the ball rolling in them telling the story. And as I said, circling back on details. So, the client tells you their story, they've been talking for quite some time. And in their story, they mentioned something about a nasty email that they got from their supervisor, their commanding officer, several months before they were discharged. Going back to that and saying, you mentioned that nasty email. Tell me more about that. What happened before? What did the email say? Did you say anything back? All those types of things. It's helpful to provide a warning before jumping into the topic, letting your client know. Again, as I said, I provide a warning even before the meeting, but then also once we're in the meeting, I'll remind them that that's what we're here to do today. If you have to ask invasive questions, explaining why you need the information. And I even do that not just with invasive questions. Certain questions can come off as if there might be a right or wrong answer and can make the client worried. So for example, I ask all my clients whether they reported. It's okay if they didn't report. As Chesley said, it's not a requirement to have reported. However, it's certainly helpful if they did report. And so I want to know that. So I will say to them, it's perfectly fine if you didn't, but did you happen to file a report? Listen as much as you can up front and ask your follow-up questions later. Allow your client the time to speak and tell their story. One of the things I think is really important to keep in mind when you're doing these cases is there often isn't a sense of true justice for survivors in the military system. As Chesley said, very few survivors report, and very few survivors who do report see an end to their case that they find satisfying. And VA compensation isn't compensation that is supposed to apologize for what happened to them. It doesn't acknowledge wrongdoing on the part of the VA. And so the definition of what is justice in these cases can be really convoluted and difficult. And so I try to think about, as I'm working with clients on these cases, how can I make it so that even if we're not successful in this claim, this experience of telling their story, being believed by me, is a win for the client in some way, a small win, but sometimes really the biggest win for the client is being believed. Be comfortable with silence. You will have silence with these clients. You will have silence in these interviews, and that's okay. Oftentimes you might feel uncomfortable, but your client actually doesn't. Your client is processing what's happening. And leave the door open for other things later. I will sometimes say to my clients, if later tonight you have something pop up in your head, shoot me an email. That's fine. We can talk about it later. Sometimes there are times where I can tell that the client is really having a tough time, and I ask them if they want to continue the conversation at another time. That's okay. You can be flexible. As I said, I like to provide options for the format with my clients. I will tell them they can meet me in person. We can talk on the phone. They can write a draft of a statement that I then review and ask follow-up questions. They can work with a therapist. Any way that you can provide that flexibility empowers your client over their experience. Make sure you never say, I understand. Just wipe that sentence out of your vocabulary. The truth is we don't understand, and we can't understand our clients' experiences. We can sympathize and we can sometimes empathize with aspects of their story, but we can't truly understand. And so I never tell them I do. Remember that if you are comfortable with the questions you're asking your client, they will be comfortable answering them. Our doctors ask us very invasive questions all the time, and we don't find it weird because they're comfortable asking them and we understand why they're asking them. You will sometimes have to ask very detailed questions about sexual assault and rape and specific acts that were committed against your client. The more comfortable you are talking about those things, the more comfortable your client will be answering them. So after you've met with the client and they've given you their personal statement, you've gotten all those records, as Chesley mentioned, you got to put together your brief. I sort of like to lay out my brief with an introduction, facts, an analysis of my arguments, and then a conclusion. The conclusion is usually fairly short. The introduction tends to follow the same sort of formula every time I do it, where I basically introduce what I'm here for, what the veteran's diagnosis are, and the fact that it's tied to their service. The facts, it's important to cite to all relevant records that you're pulling in, reports, medical records, all those markers that Chesley mentioned, citing to your client's affidavit, creating a clear timeline of your client's military service all the way till today, and all of the markers that are present. Make sure you look at that list of markers and you look for every single one you can pull in. Your analysis, any arguments needed to supplement the facts. Remind the VA that when in doubt, when the evidence is equiposed, the case goes to the veteran should win that claim. Any relevant precedent, there's often not a lot with these cases, but if you have it, use it. If you're doing an appeal, you're going to lay out specific issues that were in the initial decision, address any flawed CMPs. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Other evidence to tie in, buddy statements. If you need help narrowing down the timing of an event, if the veteran had someone they either served with or someone back at home they wrote a letter to, or they called or confided in, those can all help narrow down the timeline we're talking about. Medical opinions, super helpful for when there's a long gap between the incident in the service and today. That 80-year-old client of mine, I really needed their doctor to write a really strong letter explaining that yes, it had been 60 years since her service, but in therapy, she was processing her rape. That is still what she was suffering from. Also helpful if there are other traumas in the veteran's life to narrow down that no, what is causing this diagnosis is in fact the rape. Or the assault or the harassment, and all those medical records that you can find. Helpful to prep your client for their CMP exam. These exams are difficult and traumatizing for the veteran. Think about the fact that your client once again has to go in front of a total stranger and tell them their story. I prep with the client shortly before their exam. Sometimes I do it multiple times. So I'll talk to them, as soon as we put in the claim, and then I'll remind them shortly before the exam. Let them know what to expect regarding length of time, the fact that their exam might be at a place they've never been to before if they're working with an independent contractor exam. It's important to remind your clients that now, under very new law, veterans can choose the gender of their examiner. So if they have a preference of the examiner's gender, they should make that known when the VA calls to schedule that appointment. You can look at the DBQ for whatever the medical condition is to sort of help prepare your client for the types of questions they're going to get. Finding out whether someone can accompany them to the exam. Usually examiners will not allow that person in the exam, but they can wait outside and be there when they leave the exam. I did this with several of my clients, and there were times where I was very glad that I was there, as they, afterwards were clearly spiraling, and I was able to make sure they got assistance. And as I said, sometimes scheduling a meeting with the therapist for following the exam if I'm concerned about their safety. These can all be very helpful. Also helpful to prepare your client for the fact that the CMP exam will not just touch upon the sexual assault, but the examiner will ask about pre and post-service trauma outside, because again, the VA is looking to make sure that that mental health diagnosis is tied to their in-service assault rather than other incidents. So preparing them for the fact that it's not just going to focus on their assault. If you're doing a hearing with your client, again, every time you are able to set those expectations, communicate to the client what to expect, it gives them back a sense of power. It lets them know that they are aware and in control of what is going on. Because remember that at its very core, rape and sexual assault are moments of a complete loss of power and a loss of control for your client. And so anything we can do to put the power back in their hands is going to make this process better for your client. Ensuring there are no surprises, at least from you. Obviously, we can't control what the judge is going to do, but making sure the client knows what you're going to be talking about, what you're going to say. Making sure your client feels prepared for their testimony. How much is needed is going to depend on the individual client, but it's important to do some prep with them. Now, if you are dealing with a VA appeal, it's really important to pinpoint the issue that's the focus of the appeal. Is the issue that the VA doesn't believe that the in-service assault happened, or is the issue that the VA knows the assault happened but can't make the tie between their in-service assault and their current diagnosis? Or maybe the VA doesn't believe they have their current diagnosis. Maybe the VA doesn't believe the severity of their symptoms. Whatever it is, make sure you figure that out before beginning your appeal so that you know where to focus your efforts. Don't relitigate things the VA has already conceded. If the VA said they believe the in-service assault, you grab that concession and you use it in your appeal. Address any negative evidence that they have found. If they said, oh, there's this in the case, or there's this, and we found this, make sure you address it head on. Common errors that the VA makes in these cases are evidence gathering issues, such as not getting private treatment records. The VA is supposed to make reasonable efforts to gather those records. I often recommend getting them from the client directly, getting them from that medical facility and submitting them yourself. The evidence should have caused the VA to schedule a CMP, but they didn't. Or the claim was based on an insufficient medical opinion. Oftentimes there are medical opinions that are not sufficient to meet the VA standards, and making sure that the medical expert is an expert and is addressing all elements of the claim. Lastly, a bad CMP exam. This happens a lot with these claims, unfortunately. Really important to address this in the appeal. I had an examiner who my client had been date raped while blacked out after drinking one night. And the examiner described the assault as consensual, intoxicated sex. That's not a thing. And I needed to address that in my appeal. I needed to make clear that the examiner's entire opinion should be brought into question by the fact that that is how she characterized a sexual assault. Making sure that the examiner considered all of the relevant evidence, or whether or not they reviewed the file. If you can, getting a DBQ or a letter from the veteran's treating provider to compete with the negative CMP, so that there's at least multiple opinions being thrown at the VA, so that they can weigh that evidence and hopefully find that the balance is in your favor. Lastly, I just want to touch upon the fact that this work will impact you. Sometimes our clients' experiences will trigger us. They will cause us to have difficulty. I came into this work as a sexual assault survivor myself, and so this is something that I've had to keep in mind. But even if you've never experienced sexual assault, you may have experienced other things that you share with your clients, such as racism or poverty or a really bad work experience. Whatever it may be, your client's stories may affect you. Even if you don't share something with your client, just listening to these stories is very difficult and can often be overwhelming. Your symptoms may mirror your clients. You may be exhausted, you may be angry, you may be irritable, you may notice that you're taking it out on your spouse or your roommate or your partner or your friends. You may start avoiding the client because you don't want to hear about the story anymore. It is a fallacy to believe that we can just pretend that vicarious trauma isn't a part of this work. It unfortunately is. It is unfortunately an unavoidable part of this work. And so it is important to pay attention when you are experiencing it. Talk with your supervisor, talk with your professor, talk with your colleagues and friends in the clinic about what you're experiencing. Oftentimes talking with other people who've experienced this too is the most comforting thing. And setting those boundaries we talked about earlier on will help to alleviate some of these symptoms so that you have time to recover and time to be ready to deal with the next client. Make sure that you are engaging in self-care, whatever that is for you. That may be going to a therapist, that may be playing softball with some friends, that may be sitting on the couch and watching your favorite movie, maybe watching videos of cute puppies on YouTube, whatever it might be. Make sure that you are taking care of yourself, because if you're not able to be the best lawyer possible for your clients. I think that wraps us up.
Thank you, Samantha and Chesley. We have lots of questions, so I know I only have 10 minutes. I tried to kind of group them together. This was a wonderful presentation. I think we all appreciated it. The first question we have is, as a student who may be only working in the clinic for one semester, how do you build rapport with the client knowing that you have an end date?
Right. I think to some degree, I would say it depends on if you are the first student the client has worked with before, right? I have some clients who've been with our clinic for multiple semesters at this point, so they know that you have an end date and they understand that's coming. If they don't, I would be upfront with them about the fact that you're going to be working on their case for the next 4 months or whatever it might be, so that they know that you are going to leave at the end. But at the end of the day, I think that what matters the most to our clients is the fact that while you are with them, you are caring, you are listening, you are going to do everything you can to work hard on their case and get as much done as possible. And so, yes, your relationship is temporary, but it is, to some degree, all of these relationships we have with our clients are sometimes temporary. There's always an end date, whether it's the middle of the case or the full end. At some point, there is that transition that has to happen with the client. And the more upfront you can be about it, I think the better you're going to be.
When a client doesn't feel terribly comfortable with a CMP examiner, maybe they've had a bad CMP examiner in the past, maybe that has re-traumatized them. How do you counsel them when it comes to going to see another CMP examiner if the VA scheduled that?
I usually, I'll be upfront with them. I can't guarantee that this examiner is going to be better. To the extent that I'm able to have a sense of what went wrong in the previous exam, whether it be the examiner really didn't understand this particular element of what happened, or maybe I'll try to counsel the client as much as I can around to avoid that issue again, right? So it looks like last time the examiner just really didn't understand the fact that you may have consented, but you felt pressured because he was your boss. Make sure you really talk about the dynamic between your commanding officer and you leading up to everything that happened. So trying to add that in. Also talking to the client about the fact that the CMP exam is one part of the entire process, that I have addressed issues that happened before. And I also remind the client repeatedly about the fact that there is a closed time frame for this exam, and then it's going to be done. They got to grin and get through it, and it's hard. And making sure you are being very clear that you do know it's hard and you want to set up as much support as you can. But they will be out of that room within that time frame, and they never have to talk to the examiner ever again.
As a follow-up, what if they assign you to that bad examiner again? Is there anything you can do as an advocate to prevent that from happening?
I call the VA. I will call the regional office, or usually it's the regional office that I'll contact, and I will say, we noted in our appeal that part of the issue here is that the previous exam was problematic for X reasons. I need the client to be scheduled with another examiner. Usually if you cause a fit, throw a bit of a fit with the regional office, they will ultimately reschedule the veteran. Unfortunately, I have had them have the veteran go back to that same examiner. And then I have sent in as much additional documentation as I can. And I have called the VA again after the exam to hopefully get someone else and just register the fact that this is a problem and that they should be looking at that exam with skeptical eyes from the get-go.
Knowing that the veteran's testimony may be the most powerful thing in a case, how do you counsel them about a hearing when maybe they're not terribly comfortable opening up to anybody?
So first of all, I consider in these cases whether a hearing is the best route to go, right? A hearing isn't always the best option. I have some clients who I've talked to them and they're like, just to be honest with you, I would fall apart. Like I won't be able to talk. And if that's where they're at, then a hearing isn't going to be helpful in this case. Then I will, write a really strong brief and rest on the writing. But if the client wants to speak and wants to go forward, prep is key. Doing mock interviews. If you have, if you're working with the veteran, asking them, can I bring in a different student to interview you so that they get that experience of talking to someone they haven't met before can be a really good way of doing that. Again, holding that paperclip, you can hold it during a hearing, things like that, where they can feel, I have stress balls I give to clients, I've got paper clips I give to clients, whatever they need to do to get through it, reminding them that it's okay if they get upset. It's okay if they get emotional in their testimony. They're a human and the judge is expecting that and knows that. And the adjudicator is prepared for that. If they need to take a moment, take some deep breaths, that's okay. And so, in remote world where I can sit with the client, sending them that, that reassuring look of just like, you're doing fine, just keep going through, and letting them know that whatever happens, it's okay.
So Chesley, you talked a little bit about, the response from the trauma may be different for different people, right? And I think we know that in the MST world, when you start learning about how trauma impacts people, how do you teach the VA that is what's happening? And how do you explain it when maybe they don't know enough about this area?
Since a lot of veterans are reacting differently based on their background, any other stressful life experiences they had, their gender, I would just kind of point that's why they're acting this way. It's because they may have experienced this way or they may have grown up this way, kind of really show what factors in their life is the reason why they have experienced it or they're reacting to the MST differently than what the VA may consider to be the normal reaction, even though there is no set of common symptoms or a normal reaction.
I also sometimes try to see if I can find a medical journal article where they talk about people having similar symptoms. I had a client who had gotten a pretty important detail of her story confused for reasons that made a lot of sense given what she had been through. And so I found a lot of journal articles about why survivors misremember details of their story and what and tried to, I think I also got a letter from her doctor talking about the fact that this is very common with survivors of sexual assault. So anything you can do from the medical side to really educate them, right? With the case where I had the consensual intoxicated sex, I was bringing in definitions of sexual assault for them and educating them on what consent means. Sometimes you've got to really hit them over the head with it.
That's really helpful. There was a question about whether if a survivor does report, but it doesn't end up in their OMPF, but it does end up in maybe the assailant's records and maybe went through court-martial or they were disciplined and discharged for that assault. Is there any way to access those records to show that it happened in service?
Interesting. I have not dealt with that before, so I'm actually not sure of the answer to that. I'm not sure how one would go about getting those records as they're not those of the veterans. So I'm not quite sure of the answer to that. I definitely have struggled with the issue of reports not being where they should be. I had a client who had filed a restricted report, which for those of you who are less familiar with that, it means that there was no action taken after the report. The report basically is just that, a report, and that's the end of the story. And the restricted report was nowhere to be found. And when I emailed DOD about it, I was informed that they used to have a policy where they would throw out restricted reports after 5 years. And so I submitted to the VA a copy of that email. And I said, well, we can't find the report, but apparently DOD was throwing it out, so you can't hold that against us.
Wow, I did not know that. That's important to know. I think we're at time. So, Matt, if you want to take it away, but thank you, Chesley and Samantha. That was a fantastic presentation, and we really appreciate your time and your expertise.
All right. Thank you so much. First off, I want to thank all of you today for attending. I also want to thank all of our fantastic presenters. These were fantastic presentations, even for us advocates. We are all still learning. This is not only just because a lot of us are ourselves new to the area of law. It's a fairly young, I think, practice area as far as colleagues go, but it just is a new area, as Judge Allen was indicating during his keynote speech. And so even more recently than what he was mentioning, though, it's even only been more recent than that, than it was open to the vast majority of attorneys without having to go to court, that the agency itself opened up. So I want to first tell the students to consider staying in this area. Obviously, that's why we're doing this, to train you up to be the next generation. And you've got some of the best mentors you could possibly have to do that. Everybody that's presented here, help put together this, is a member of the consortium, and just the fact that your law school puts value in having the Veterans Law Clinic shows that there is a need for this service. And what you heard a lot about is that we get great satisfaction from doing it because of the impact that we can make. So I would implore you again to stay in this area, network, whatever you could do for opportunities at various other clinics. Sometimes clinics put up other opportunities for summers and things like that. They need fellows. Even afterwards, you could do fellowships, as some of our presenters are. You can work at nonprofits, law firms, and even, of course, going into the government, because it wouldn't make much sense for us to try and talk you out of working at the VA or working for the board or working for the court, even though we're, as Judge Allen was mentioning, other systems are supposed to be adversarial, largely. That would be just as good as doing the work directly for the clients, is that, you're the decision maker at the other side of the table and you're applying the laws and regulations correctly. So, being big fish in little pond was certainly part of what attracted me to this. I also want to give a thanks to the boot camp committee, everybody that was involved in putting this together. We're going to have, just as a reminder, we're going to have today's session along with yesterday's session. Is going to be up on our YouTube page. You can see it behind me here. That's a shortened link. That's legitimate. And, subscribe. We'll be getting it up shortly. So, just give us a few days to get that up, but you should see that as well as all the materials. I know that my slides yesterday were a little fuzzy in the beginning, so hopefully you'll be able to read those better. And also, the consortium recently added something new this year, a student listserv. So, we would like to see more activity on that, get together with other students, ask other students questions, and, utilize that resource. So I will let everybody go with just have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you for joining us on a Saturday. Oh, and one last thing is, we are going to be sending out some requests for feedback, and we will use that feedback. Part of the planning for this year heavily incorporated the feedback we received from last year. So we do take it to heart and use it, and looking forward to seeing a lot of you do great things this year. And please, the consortium is very interested in highlighting the work that you do throughout the year. So please, you or your professor, if they want you to go through them, please let the consortium leadership know when you have a big victory, when you have a good result or something memorable, we would love to highlight it on our website or YouTube or whatever it may be. So, but other than that, just have a great rest of your weekend, and thank you so much for joining us today.